Yesterday, the Supreme Court underscored a principle that's in part of the Constitution of the United States of America from the very beginning. Even the most powerful president in the world cannot rewrite the Constitution to win an argument about economics. 24 hours ago, President Trump suffered a significant legal defeat on one of the defining policies of his political identity, his tariffs. For years, Donald Trump described tariffs as a kind of economic superpower, a way to punish foreign countries and rich Americans and raise money for the government at the same time. He said repeatedly that other nations were paying us trillions of dollars. In his telling, tariffs were not just policy, they were proof that America could act alone and quickly solve complicated global trade problems. Yesterday, the Supreme Court rejected the legal basis for a specific group of those tariffs, the sweeping import taxes that the president imposed using emergency economic powers. These tariffs covered familiar goods like many everyday imported products and auto-related parts. But in this case, the authority Trump used to impose those tariffs was designed for real emergencies that allow a president to act quickly during a sudden economic or national crisis. The court said those emergency powers cannot be stretched into a long-term substitute for Congress writing tax policy. These were not traditional tariffs passed by Congress through normal trade laws. Instead, they were broad taxes placed on many imported goods based on the president's claims of emergency authority. In simple terms, the court concluded that emergency powers can't be used to impose what are essentially taxes unless Congress clearly allows it. Donald Trump responded quickly, saying he's got a backup plan. He initially said he would impose an additional 10% global tariff, and he had some choice words for the Supreme Court justices who ruled against him.
Today, I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged. And I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution. It's my opinion that the court has been swayed by foreign interests and a political movement that is far smaller than people would ever think.
Swayed by foreign interests. Wow. Last night, Trump said he did sign an executive order enabling to bypass Congress and impose that global 10% tariff. And this morning, he posted on social media that he would be increasing that global tariff to 15%. Now, this response matters because the implications extend well beyond trade policy. At its core, this case is about presidential power, about whether a president can expand his authority when Congress chooses not to act. So before we get into the politics, it helps to understand how tariffs actually work. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. It makes those goods more expensive to discourage people from buying something that is made or grown in another country in favor of buying something that is made or grown in your country. When products arrive at America's ports, companies, the importers, pay that tax to the U.S. government. Businesses might absorb the cost, or they might raise prices to cover that cost. Either way, most of the financial impact happens inside the United States. Foreign companies aren't paying the tariffs, which means that despite Donald Trump's messaging suggesting otherwise, economists across the political spectrum largely agree on one point. In practice, Americans bear most of the cost of these tariffs. Now, before Trump's tariffs, between 2018 and 2023, tariff collections generated, on average, roughly $91 billion in federal revenue per year. Take a look at the bar on the right side of your screen, though. Last year, Trump's supercharged tariffs generated 3 times as much money, which is significant, but far short of the trillions of dollars Donald Trump repeatedly claimed foreign countries were paying. Foreign governments didn't pay those tariffs. America's importers paid those tariffs, and some of that cost was passed on to American businesses and consumers. At the same time, Trump and members of his administration argued that refunds would be difficult if courts later ruled that the tariffs were unlawful because the money had already been spent. Which leads to a question many Americans may reasonably ask. If you bought a car last year and you paid $1,000 more because tariffs raised the prices, do you get your money back? Probably not. If refunds are ordered by lower courts, the money would first go to the companies that paid the tariffs, the manufacturers or the distributors, maybe even the retailers. Whether consumers ever see lower prices would depend on lawsuits and contracts and market competition. Economics moves forward quickly. It rarely moves backward the same way. And after almost a year of economic uncertainty that supporters said would fundamentally reshape global trade, let's look at what actually changed. The U.S. trade deficit, with which Donald Trump is obsessed, improved, or was reduced, let's say, by roughly $2.1 billion, which sounds like a lot of money. But the U.S. economy is nearly $30 trillion. 2-point-something billion is a rounding error. It's barely measurable after almost a year of economic uncertainty and retaliatory tariffs from other countries and repeated supply chain adjustments. The effects of the tariffs have been widespread. Farmers faced retaliation from trading partners overseas. Manufacturers paid more for raw materials at home. Ports saw trade volumes rise and fall unpredictably. And now states and businesses may face another period of uncertainty as Donald Trump imposes these new tariffs and courts decide whether refunds are required and companies adjust their supply chains yet again. But what happened yesterday was not just a trade decision by the Supreme Court, because tariffs are not only trade policy. They are, in fact, taxes. And the Constitution clearly states who has the power to create taxes. It's Congress, not the president. That division of power was not accidental. In fact, trade and tariffs were among the very first problems that the framers of the Constitution were trying to solve. Under the Articles of Confederation, the young United States had no unified trade policy. Individual states imposed their own tariffs on goods coming from abroad, and sometimes even on goods coming from other states. Foreign governments exploited that disunity, negotiating separately with states and playing American ports against one another. The result was economic instability and political weakness. So when the framers met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention in 1787, one of their clearest decisions was to place control over trade and taxation firmly in the hands of Congress, which they deemed to be the branch closest to the people and most accountable through regular elections. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Those words are specific and deliberate. Alexander Hamilton argued that national control over tariffs was essential to economic stability. James Madison warned that concentrating taxing authority in a single executive would risk exactly the kind of unchecked power that the revolution had been fought to escape. Tariffs, in other words, were never meant to be tools of unilateral presidential action. They were meant to be debated publicly, to be negotiated politically, and to be enacted collectively. For much of American history, tariffs were the federal government's primary source of revenue, long before the income tax existed. That's the reason the framers treated them as fundamentally legislative powers, not executive powers. So when the Supreme Court ruled yesterday that emergency authority cannot substitute for Congress when setting tariffs, it wasn't creating any new law. It was just reaffirming one of the oldest economic principles in the Constitution itself. And so the question before the court was not entirely new. It was, in many ways, the same question that the framers confronted at the founding. Who should control the power to tax and shape the nation's economic relationship with the world? One elected leader acting alone, or the representatives of the people acting together through Congress? Yesterday's ruling placed the court squarely within that long constitutional tradition. Writing for the court, Chief Justice John Roberts said, quote, "The framers did not vest any part of the taxing power in the executive branch," end quote. Any part. That sentence does more than settle a dispute about tariffs. It restates a founding principle that economic power, like political power, must be shared, debated, and limited. And at a time when many Americans wonder whether institutions still work the way they were designed to, yesterday's decision offered a quiet reminder. The Constitution does not prevent disagreement or ambition, but it can still set boundaries, even when a president